The 1 and the 9 in this box are interesting. Oh, actually, sorry. Where does the 9 go in this box? We have a digit. 9 in box 4. Can't go in the row with a 9. Can't go in pink. Can't go on a between line. So the 9 is placed here. That being a 9, that gets us a digit dance. Do, 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 da, 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 da.
Orange is a max of 5, so blue is a max of 3. So red is a max... Oh, this is it. Red's a max of 2. And red is on this thermometer, which means purple is a max of 1, and therefore purple is 1. So I think we go like this. 1, 2.
Row 8, column 8? That can't be a lot of things. That can't be any digit which goes in an 8 cage. It can't be green, it can't be blue, and it can't be 2, 6, 4, 8, or 9. And that can't be a 9, because if that was a 9, these do have to add up to 8. So that can't be a 9. That's a 4, 8 pair now. Beautiful. Absolutely beautiful.
This can't be a 4. Okay, that's interesting. So it's a 16 or a 9. So that too is a 9 or a 16. Now, if they were both 16s, that's 57, and that's too much. So one is a 9 and one is a 16, and that is a 5.
Ah, now this is weird, right? I'm wondering all of a sudden if this is a colouring problem. Look at this domino here. The nature of an X domino is always has the same parity, both cells. Obviously, you're going to an even digit. Look at this in the context of this black dot down here. This black dot has a 4 on it. Now, if this was 2, 8, you can't now make this work. Both of those squares would be a 4, and I don't need any excuse. I'm going to colour that.
So that will be blue, and then this will be different, so that will be yellow. So that will be blue, so that will be different, so that will be yellow. Now, go back to this box, and we remember this has to be 10 higher than those. That cell now can't be 1 or 2. That cell can't be 1 or 2. So the minimum I can put into those cells now are 3 and 4. This has to be 10 higher than the minimums of 3 and 4, which is 17, which is an 8-9 pair. That is insane. Wow.
Hello, welcome everyone. Welcome to Twototenth's Setter Spotlight. Hello, Twototenth.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on. Thanks everyone for coming out to watch these. Yeah, good to catch you live as well, Florian. We're watching you live in the chat. Very entertaining. How are you doing today, Twototenth?
I'm doing pretty well. It's been Thanksgiving week in the U.S., so I've had a couple extra days off work. So
right.
Nice and
I
rested.
always forget Thanksgiving is so very different from the U.S. and Canada. They're like over a month apart.
Right.
Very confusing when I get a bunch of Thanksgiving content far after Thanksgiving has occurred for me. But anyways, below you can see that there's all our Patreons spread out there, and there's a link to Patreon in the description, so if you want to support us on Patreon, feel free to do that. And the Patreons sponsor, I mean, we're going to do this segment anyway, but sponsor this segment where we talk about more of a warm-up to the interview, and ask some questions like, what's your favorite movie?
My favorite movie is probably The Princess Bride.
Ooh, that's a good choice.
It might not be the most conventional choice necessarily for a mid-30s guy, but it's, yeah, I just cannot get over how fun that movie is, basically.
Yeah, that movie is great. Inconceivable. Favorite TV show?
My favorite TV show is probably The Good Place.
Oh, nice. Yeah, I definitely agree with that as well. Good recommendations from Twototenth, at least ones that I agree with. So, what do you do for work?
I work for an alarm company. I am in the office and kind of coordinating third-party subcontractors who run service for our customers.
Cool.
Which is not necessarily a super fascinating job all the time, but it pays the bills, and I don't mind doing it. So,
yeah. I have this question that I haven't. Maybe I have asked like one person this. But what's your dream job? What did you want to do when you were younger?
I don't know that I ever had a dream job in mind necessarily. Um, I certainly would not necessarily pictured myself doing what I'm doing now, but even like currently, I don't know that I necessarily have something I would definitely want to do for 40 hours a week for years on
Yeah.
end. So until something comes to mind, I'm good where I am.
Okay. Uh, and whereabouts do you live? Like mid US? Is that? I think that's where
Yes,
I'm thinking.
Oklahoma.
Oklahoma. Nice. Do you have any hobbies or interests outside of puzzling?
Yeah, they're not any less nerdy than puzzling, but I have a large collection of statistics spreadsheets for sports. Uh, my kind of current ongoing project in that regard is basically, you know how there's an ongoing ranking in like tennis or golf of who the number one player in the world is, who the number eight player in the world is. Uh, there's a guy who does baseball statistics who came up with a way to do that for starting pitchers.
Right.
And he did that from like 1990 to present. And I kind of refined his method a little bit and started it back in 1902, and have got all the way up to 1996 so far.
Is that like a personal adventure goal thing, or is it like a public repository of statistics?
Uh, I mostly just keep the actual spreadsheets and stuff to myself, but I'll kind of post about it in various places online, and you know, have trivia questions of who were the number one pitchers during this decade, that kind of thing.
Cool. Interesting. Do you play sports yourself, or are you just sort of like a sports viewer guy kind of guy?
I used to play a little bit, but never especially well, and I'm kind of past the point where I would be able to do that and not regret it for a couple days afterwards.
Right. Do you have any pets?
No, no pets. I
Okay.
grew up with them and have not had any myself because I live by myself and I don't want to leave, a dog by itself in the apartment for 9 hours during the day.
Right. Right. Yeah. Do you have a favorite cuisine, favorite food?
Is it incredibly cliche if I say pizza?
No, I mean, pizza's
It's
good.
Italian in general,
Yeah.
along with pizza, basically.
Favorite kind of music?
Uh, Generally probably classic rock, I would say. Which I
Yeah.
know the definition of classic rock changes as you move along, but 70s and 80s, that era generally.
Yeah, fair enough. How do you balance puzzling with other things in your life?
That's a good question. I think I've gotten better at it than I used to be. Basically, because I don't spend as much time puzzling as I used to.
Yeah.
I used to post, a puzzle a week on Logic Masters, and that's down to one every 2 weeks. And back when I was doing one a week, I would still maintain a backlog of 3 or 4 puzzles. And now I basically try and just have one ready by the time I post the previous one.
Right. Right. Yeah, I think everyone, well, not maybe not everyone, but I think it's in an eventuality that you sort of wane in your productivity of puzzles when, especially if the quality of them is getting higher or the ambition of them.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of one of the things I wanted to mention in this is like,
Yeah.
I know you've had a lot of people on who set, absurd number of puzzles,
Yeah.
Jovial or Turganus or Clover or
Grackles. Yeah.
Grockles. Um, and like, I kind of want to bring up like that can kind of come off as intimidating if you don't, if you're just starting out. Like, you don't necessarily have to set three
Right.
puzzles a day to be good at setting. You can set one every couple weeks or once a month or something like that, and still do well.
Definitely. I mean, I think it's more how much you learn from each setting experience that you have than how many total puzzles you've actually done. You can learn the same amount from one puzzle that you could from maybe seven very easy sets that don't really challenge you in the same way, you know?
Absolutely, yeah.
All right, we're clearly talking about puzzles now, so let's move into the puzzle segment of the discussion. What was the first puzzle that you ever set?
The first puzzle I set is up on Logic Masters. It's called Revivify. It has been kind of funny for me to hear people come on the stream and talk about how bad their first puzzles were. I'm actually pretty happy with that one, honestly. For a first puzzle, I think it's pretty good. Yeah, it was. I had gotten started after Jovial setting video, actually.
Mhm.
Partly because I didn't know what F puzzles was until I watched that, but also because it had a lot of other good advice in it. And so it was, a month or so after that, I just had the break-in for this kind of pop into my head, which is how I start a lot of puzzles. Is just the break-in appears, and then I sat down one evening and took probably 2 or 3 hours, and this was probably pretty characteristic of a first set in that I basically just put the first thing I could think of into the grid at each stage of the puzzle, and tested it out, and it seemed to work, and the solver confirmed it was unique, and then the next morning I looked up how to post things on Logic Masters and put it up on Logic Masters.
Wow, you figured that all out in a very small amount of time. I feel like the first time I posted Logic Masters, it was a several-day adventure of figuring out what the heck is going on.
Yeah, I was pleasantly surprised that I was able to actually get it up there after having to figure out the posting guide for new puzzles.
Right. So did Jovi's setting video directly inspire this puzzle specifically, or just the fact that you decided to set?
There wasn't anything about this specific setup that came from Jovi's setting video necessarily. It was more just kind of the ideas behind setting, and kind of starting from a break-in and working through a solve path. Kind of just the general things that we all kind of take for granted at this point as setters, where it's like, yes,
Right.
of course, this is how you set a puzzle, but I'd never really thought about how to do it before I'd watched that.
Mm-hmm. Were you surprised at like how easy or maybe even how hard it was to find a setup that worked or a setup that you enjoyed?
I think I was probably pretty pleasantly surprised by how easy it was. I will say the break-in in this puzzle takes up way too much space. It
Right.
literally takes up space in all 9 boxes of the puzzle, and so it was kind of hard squeezing things around, and that's why there's little killer clues scattered around the edges too, because I couldn't get it done with killer on its own. That was a lesson learned on that one. Yeah, I think it's still, for a first puzzle, I'm pretty happy with it. It did well on Logic Masters, and was my most solved puzzle for quite a while. It's not anymore, but two-star
it's
killer
a
puzzles are
2-star killer, so yeah, they do get a lot of attention. Let's talk about not just your first puzzle, but your second puzzle. We were actually having a conversation privately about this. It's also a pretty impressive puzzle for a second puzzle. So let's talk about this a little bit.
Yeah, this one did really well. I think it's at 97% currently, which I'm quite happy with for what it is. And yeah, this was a learning experience too, because the break-in is boxes 1, 3, 7, and 9. And then I hadn't realized while I was setting that how much the break-in does on its own.
Right.
So I kept finding things that I hadn't realized while I was putting it together. I kept trying to, add clues in box 8, which you can see apart from the 2 sticky outy parts is completely empty. And I didn't need to do that at all. I kept having to adjust the cage totals too, because the way I had box 1 set up was broken at first, and so I had to. I think it was an 18 and a 26 instead of a 20 and a 24. I had to adjust that. And, this one took me, I think, 3 days or so to get down. And yeah, I kept kind of finding new stuff and adjusting the clues so I could use the new stuff that I had found. But yeah, I'm happy with how it turned out. It seems to have worked out pretty good.
So I guess unlike what you said about your first puzzle, saying like, oh, I just sort of put the first thing that came into mind into the grid and it worked out. This one, you took a few more days to do it, so you were trying different things and things were not working and you were trying different aspects. Is this like you've already at this point learned that you need to Sorry, I don't know if you can hear my cat just screaming his head off for some reason. Uh, at this point, did you already sort of learn that it's not just the bare minimum that it needs to be unique or it needs to solve, it needs to be, I don't know, interesting, something like that?
Yeah, I think part of it was just I hadn't gotten as good at the pure Sudoku aspects as I am as a solver now, and so I
Yeah,
kept discovering another Sudoku deduction that I could make people find, basically.
right.
Um, yeah, the cage in box 5 I think changed total and position 3 or 4 times at the end. As I kept discovering, oh, 3 is restricted to these places, and then 4 is restricted to these places, and the more I could push through that, the more I could kind of lead the setter along that particular Sudoku chain, which is, I think, something I've gotten a little better at not doing in some of my puzzles since then. um, it worked out fine in this one. There's others that I've set where some of the logic that I had to find was logic that I then made other people find, and that was a bad idea.
So talk a little bit about that. So you found some logic in there that you didn't initially realize, and you're now saying that it was a bad idea to leave that in there because you didn't realize it at first. Is that what you're saying?
In this case, it was a decent idea because the logic was completely reasonable. I just
Right.
wasn't as good at solving as I am now, so I didn't spot it right away. But it was just like, Jovi wing on 1s and then a Jovi wing on 3s, basically, and
Right.
that's obviously completely and totally fair. When you get into some of the other puzzles that I've done, it is a little nastier in those respects.
So this one, we had it in the intro, and it was the last one in the intro video where Brownster finds this blue and yellow 1-2 thing going on, and then it limits the cells in box 9 to being 3-4. And this is already showing like a little bit of the coloring relabeling thing that you're kind of well known for is this coloring aspect to it. So even at the second puzzle, you were already doing this. Was this a sort of logic that you wanted to build into your puzzles right away?
At least in this case, I saw that I could do just a little coloring step, and I thought it was kind of fun because I knew Simon loved to do coloring, and I always liked watching him do coloring. But yeah, it was. This was the only piece of coloring I had in my first 4 puzzles, and then obviously the 5th one has quite a bit more than that in it.
Right. So speaking of the 5th one, how long did it take you to get your first CTC feature?
My first puzzle was posted, I think, March 31st last year, and the first CTC feature, I think, was mid-late May, so it was a little under 2 months. Which was definitely a pleasant surprise when it happened. I think that's kind of how it... like, I had put a puzzle in testing the day before, and so I came home from work and was like, oh, I've got 9 pings on Discord. A bunch of people must have solved that puzzle I had in testing, and that was not what it was at all.
Were you surprised to have that one feature? Did you submit it, or did someone else sort of recommend it?
I think I had sent it in, but I had sent a couple other things in too, and had no basis for thinking that this one would get in. But this was actually the first one I put up for testing in the Discord. This puzzle was the reason I joined the Discord, because the F puzzle solver couldn't do it, and so I wanted to double check that my logic was good before I put it up anywhere. And so yeah, I put it in the Discord and got a couple of nice comments on it. I think Glenn Hippo put it in the recommendation thread, and then Scott Strossall actually did it on video before CTC did it by a week or two. And so, yeah, I was happy with reception at that point, and then it got featured, and so I was even happier with it.
Nice. Is it... How does it feel for those who haven't actually gotten featured or haven't had people solve their puzzles on camera? How does it feel to watch someone to solve your puzzle for the first time?
It's I'm not entirely sure how to describe it. It's really fun. Basically, you get to hopefully see someone discover the exact path you had laid out in the puzzle, and if that actually works out properly, then yeah, it's really exciting. I think it was Clover in the setting feature who described solving a puzzle as basically finding a message that had been left for her by the setter or something along those lines. And yeah,
Yeah.
it's nice to see that from the other end too. See someone kind of pick up exactly what you were
Right.
trying
Yeah.
to get across.
Even the it's funny when like I don't know. There's something funny about the setting process or funny about the solve path, and then they notice that it's funny in the moment. So it's literally like you've communicated somehow this idea that is funny to them
Yeah,
through this medium of puzzle, which is like there's nothing inherently like saying that this is funny, but it's just funny to everyone, and it's weird. I love puzzles.
yeah. I'm somewhat biased too because it was my first, but I think this is probably still my best CTC feature out of the 8. Because
Yeah,
Simon enjoys the solve on this one so much.
yeah,
And he's
and
also,
yes, sir, go ahead.
if I remember, he's working under some time pressure on this one, and so he's trying to like kind of scrambling to get it done. And there's a little bit of suspense built in because of that. But
Right. Um, this is the one that I don't know if is this the first puzzle that appeared on CTC where the entire grid was colored before the digits were put in?
I don't think so. I think there was at least one other one that I had seen that was like that. And it was maybe an arrow puzzle, and it gave me the idea for doing a pure coloring puzzle that would disambiguate at the end. But I think it's at least one of the earlier ones.
Right. Um, so was that sort of what inspired you to create that, or even have the idea that that would be possible to do?
Yeah, basically. Yeah, this one, it hasn't always been the case, but this one I definitely sat down and said, I want to make a coloring puzzle.
Right.
And the name is also basically coloring puzzle, except made more fancy. So,
Right. It's first law, the zeroth law of chromodynamics.
yep.
So speaking of CTC, when did you first start watching CTC?
I was obviously during the pandemic, just like everyone. It was probably December or January, 2020 or 2021. First video was the Miracle Sudoku, just like everyone.
Right.
The one I do want to bring up though is also one of their 15 or so most watched videos, and I think the title of it is "This Killer Sudoku Has No Digits at All." It's
Right.
Square Killer by Christoph Seeliger,
Mm.
and that was the first one that I actually solved, like through the link in their video. Because I saw the rule set and it was like, oh, this was like you could not have designed a better rule set for me to actually want to solve it. Because I love doing arithmetic and particularly arithmetic with squares, and so that just jumped off the page at me and actually went back and resolved it yesterday and registered my solve on LMD finally.
Nice.
Yeah, my first time through it, I think it took me like an hour and 15 minutes or so, and then Simon did it in 27 with intro and outro. So
Of course.
I've sped up a little bit since then.
Had you solved Sudoku at all before watching the channel?
Very occasionally, it wasn't a regular thing.
Right.
I had done easy and medium ones in the newspaper and little books that people would give me or something like that. But yeah, it had probably been 5 years since I picked one up before then.
And was it all classic before? No variant?
Yeah, it was all classic.
Right.
Which is funny because I almost never do classics now because all the classics that are on the server are terrifying.
Yeah. Very, very much terrifying. All right, so nowadays, how would you describe your setting process?
Uh, it's a lot more deliberate than it used to be, as mentioned. But generally, like I know a lot of people have said they'll just pull up F puzzles and throw things in there and play with it. I don't really do that.
Right.
I will either have an idea for a break-in and then pull up F puzzles and see if I can do that. Or even sometimes I'll wait until I have a break-in in step 2. And if I don't have an idea for a puzzle, I'll just do something else. But yeah, I don't usually start setting until the idea for the break-in is already in place.
Right.
And then once I do that,
yeah.
if at this point it usually takes me a couple days. I'll put the break in and kind of toy with it, and if I'm making progress, great, I'll keep going. If I'm not making progress, I'll leave the tab open and come back to it in a day or two and see if something else clicks.
Right. Do you often, for puzzles that you sort of have a, I know some puzzles that you're doing have a specific theme to it. When you're going into that, do you still have sort of like a break-in idea based on the theme? Maybe we'll just go to one of the themes, so this question makes a little bit more sense. Let's start with the 159 without clues in the first, fifth, or ninth columns. I know you have a few puzzles in sort of a series of 159 puzzles without any clues in the first column, fifth column, or ninth column.
Yeah, I think I have 8 of those now.
8, wow.
So the first one is the thermo, and that one I just kind of wanted to see if I could do it, because 159 was pretty popular at the time. It has kind of tailed off now, but it was kind of during the 159 craze, and I had done a couple. I did one for the Lockout Patreon pack, and then I did one with German Whispers. But most of the 159 puzzles you were seeing would have a lot of stuff in columns 1, 5, and 9, and I kind of wanted to see if that was avoidable. Turns out it was. I could do it with the thermo, and I did it with a lot fewer clues than I expected to, and kind of went from there. And everything since the thermo has been clue type that you can't make a unique puzzle with on its own without givens or other kinds of clues, plus 159.
Right, which is incredibly cool. But what I was asking was when you're going to set one of these, because it's sort of like a pre-described theme or almost a rule that you have to follow in the puzzle creation. Do you go into it having a break-in in mind, or are you looking for how you can use it?
Generally, I'll still have the break-in in mind first.
That's
and
impressive.
for the most part, the break-ins are pretty easy to find, with a couple exceptions. But so the Renbon with just the 2 3-cell Renbons in box 9, I knew would force, spoiler for the puzzle, I knew it would force 159 into the indexing column.
Right.
Or the between line, obviously, the break-in is just the 6-cell between line that goes through all of the non-indexing cells in the box. Most of those are pretty easy to come up with, and then I would play with it from there. Entropic lines and X's and white dots were tougher to think through. But even with those, like, F puzzles didn't come up until the break-in had been conceptualized.
Do you conceptualize the break-in on paper or on F puzzles or whatever, or do you conceptualize it in your head before?
Usually in my head.
So do you find you have a lot of like a working memory, like you're able to hold a lot of things in your head at once?
Yeah, especially when I was starting out, like for negative space, the second puzzle, I had the entire grid memorized while I was working on it, which I don't necessarily recommend doing or anything like that, but it had sunk in pretty deep at that point.
Yeah.
So I could, if I was bored at work, I could pull up an Excel spreadsheet and enter everything in there and see what options I had.
Right, just sitting in a meeting, like just blinking, and you're actually just solving the Sudoku from scratch again in your head. I can't remember what movie it is, but there's some movie with somebody who has an eidetic memory, and they're like looking at like a wall, and they just like, I don't know, take like not a pen or a pencil, but just like some non-writing utensil and just draw on the wall, and it like writes out in their mind like the things. That's what I'm imagining when when you're saying that you memorize the entire grid.
Yeah, I don't have an eidetic memory. It's just not quite
Right.
to that level, but when I do something over and over again, it sinks in pretty quick.
Right.
and that puzzle I've been working on a lot, and it sunk in pretty well.
So what made you want to do the series with those 159s? Like why do it with all these different variants?
Basically because I kept having ideas. Uh, Essentially, yeah, like I had enjoyed 159 in general.
Mhm.
We can, if you want to skip ahead to the what puzzle has affected you most as a editor, it was probably Shy's original 159 puzzle,
Cool.
where she had like an X-wing and then a swordfish and all that stuff. And at that point, I hadn't even like that puzzle didn't actually teach me the high mid low trick. I learned that from another, I think it was a Glem Hippo puzzle later on that was also 159. But yeah, essentially, and also I'd already done another series that had kind of different variants with the same theme, and so I wanted to see how many of those I could work into 159 as well.
Right. Uh, so the most recent one was a few months ago, right? The Entropic Lines?
Entropic Lines was, I guess, a couple months ago now. Yeah, I think it was in September. And
And
yeah,
I
that
guess,
one,
yeah, go ahead.
that one's a beast. It was a beast to set because with so many other variants, you can just play off high, mid, low with the variant, and it has a lot of effect. And you can't do that with Entropic Lines because it's also just high, mid, low logic. That's all you have.
Right.
So it, like as soon as Entropic Lines were introduced, I was like, I wonder if I can make that work with 159. And my thought at first was probably not because there's not going to be enough there. Uh, and turned out there was enough there, but I really had to stretch the logic I could get out of everything to get it.
It's funny you say that because looking at the final grid, it does not look like like the logic has stretched. It looks actually insane. I don't think I've seen this puzzle solved, but it's nearly symmetric.
Yeah, the break-in part is definitely symmetric, and then the things that are after that kind of just jump from the break-in and do. Again, I was quite surprised at the logic I could pull out of it.
Hmm.
Um, and this was one where like I had thought of the break-in probably weeks before I started setting the puzzle, because I still wasn't sure I could do anything with it.
Right.
And then I put it in the grid and started messing around with it. And 4, 5, 6, basically you can disambiguate pretty quickly. I had to figure out how to do 1, 2, 3 versus 7, 8, 9. And once I had that, I was pretty sure I could get it done. Even with that, there was a previous version that I had thought was unique. I think I had made a logical leap in, and so I had to kind of go back to step 3 and start again from there. And then after that, there was a version I kept getting the same deadly pattern in. It was 7 8s on the left side, and then 1 2 1 3 and 2 3 on the right side with indexing with the 7 8s. And so I had to overhaul it again after that. This one took a while.
In a similar vein, you've done a series of puzzles with inequalities. So similar type where it can't be disambiguated by itself, but then there's one inequality in the grid that allows you to disambiguate the entire puzzle. Is this sort of in the same vein? You just kept having ideas for stuff like this?
Yeah, pretty much. The first one was the Renbon puzzle in that series, and I basically sat down and was like, okay, I want to do a Renbon puzzle with the minimum amount of information possible to disambiguate how the Renbon goes. And at the time, I did not realize it was going to be high-low ambiguity. That worked itself out by about step 3 of the solve, and it's fairly obvious in retrospect that was what it was going to do. I just didn't have a lot of experience with Renbon going in. It was essentially another one of those things where I just kind of wanted to push myself a little bit as a setter, and again kept having ideas for how I could do it with other constraints, and here we are.
Cool. Do you feel like these series, like the Ren, or sorry, not the Renman one, the inequality one and the 151 159, series has sort of almost pushed you to, I don't know, grow or do more insane things as a setter because there's these restrictions in place. Like you can't just add another inequality. Like it's not allowed in the series, right?
Yeah, it's
So then you
one
have to
inequality.
figure it
If
out.
you put two inequalities, it doesn't count anymore.
Right.
Which is why there's no entropic lines entry in the one inequality series. By the way, you definitely could not make that work at all. But yeah, I think there's an extent to which putting an artificial restriction on yourself as a setter can make you discover logic that you wouldn't discover otherwise.
Right.
And yeah, that's been pretty rewarding, I think, overall in terms of my setting career. So yeah, it'd be easy enough to throw a given in here or put a killer cage in or a black dot or something like that. Yeah, I wanted to kind of essentially define all 81 cells as bi values apart from the fives, and then get the inequality in the end to finish it off, and that makes you kind of stretch the logic as far as it can go.
Right. So before you even start one of these, either the 159 or the inequality things, do you already understand in your head how you're going to disambiguate it at the end, like the whole 5 thing? You need to figure out which 5 is greater than the parity, right?
The inequality goes last, definitely. I will, in the inequality series, I will spend an unreasonable amount of time obsessing over exactly where the inequality is going to go in the logic.
Right.
In terms of which cells do you get to at the very end of the solve path. And also it's that, and it's also I want it in a space where you can clearly see it. It kind of stands out. Because if it's kind of cluttered in with the rest of the lines or whatever else, then it's not as, I don't think it's as pleasant to look at. So I kind of want it to be on its own in the grid.
How much thought do you give to the aesthetic of the grid when you're setting?
Usually not a lot. In general, I will usually opt for logic over aesthetics if I am forced to make a choice between those two things.
Right.
So yeah, I'm not necessarily a particularly aesthetic setter, because I tend to the extent that I'm looking for aesthetics, I'll tend to find aesthetics in the logic rather than in the actual appearance of the grid.
Interesting. In the vein of the inequality series, some people might mistake these puzzles for a puzzle where you haven't gone into it thinking, oh, I'm going to use one inequality, I'm going to set up everything like that, and then it's going to disambiguate like that. Some people have sort of made comments about single clue, alternative clue disambiguation at the end of a puzzle being almost like lazy or displeasing to look at or anticlimactic. What are your thoughts on that sort of perspective?
There have been some comments along those lines on those puzzles on Logic Masters. And on some level, it's my job as a setter to be able to make it an interesting puzzle however you approach it. So like you'll see some comments where it's like, oh, I just plugged in one in this 1-9 spot and saw if it was right at the end, and if it wasn't, then I switched it. And other people will be like, I refuse to do that. I know when I was actually first chatting with Talkat about the Renbon entry in the puzzle, he was like, I don't want to do that, because that was what I had been doing when I was setting it, was using placeholder digits basically. And Talkat did not want to do that, and so I realized I had to make the puzzles appealing if you weren't going to do that, and still make them interesting if you were going to do that. And so there's kind of a balance you have to strike in something like that, which I may or may not have always been able to do successfully. But
so whenever you're setting these, do you solve it in both ways and make sure that it's interesting in both of those ways?
Not since the first one. I got to the point with the inequality puzzles where I could think of green 1-9 as a digit,
Right.
rather than 1 or 9. Is green 1-9 and gold 1-9 or whatever it was. And I could I A got to the point where I could scan for those almost as easily as I could full on digits, and B got to the point where I could see them in that way and still uh, be confident enough that I was satisfying people who were going to plug in placeholder digits.
Interesting. I mean, it does help if you have a good working memory as well.
Say, Woofers, I agree that using letters is good, but in this case, it predated any of the solving tools having letters as an option. So,
Well, technically, you could always plug in Pempa. You could plug in anything.
true. Yeah, I've never really set in Penpa particularly.
That's actually an interesting thing about your career is that you often are setting more sort of like with the standard tools, like using 159 and another variant, or you're using like you're using equal sum lines and doublers or something like that. You're just sort of using the tools available to you and not like coming up with a new thing. Is that true, or do you feel like, hey, I have come up with new things? Like,
I'm definitely not someone who wants to necessarily push new rule sets in a particular direction or anything like that. I mean, complete respect for people who feel comfortable doing that. But coming up with, like, again, for me, I don't start setting until I have a break-in in mind. And so coming up with a new rule set and a break-in for the new rule set at the same time is not something that has happened yet. With one exception, which is also my lowest rated puzzle on Logic Masters, which kind of scared me off of it a little bit. Yeah, that was my one attempt so far to introduce a new rule set, and it did not go well at all. And completely justifiably, basically, that puzzle could be described as here, do a bunch of very fiddly arithmetic and not have any interesting Sudoku to go with it. Have fun.
which one is that?
That's Quotient Killer.
Quotient.
It's right after Zeroth Law.
Oh yes. Okay.
The rule set is the values on the cages are the product of the digits divided by the sum of the digits.
Well, that seems like a lot.
I can't imagine that it didn't go well.
Divided by the sum of the digits. Yeah, okay, that is a lot of arithmetic. I mean, I can see how there would be some interesting cases like the 1 and maybe 1.25 would, or 0.9 would be an interesting one, or even 100 and 100.8 would be interesting too. But some of the other ones seem a little bit like this is here so that this will work sort of thing, rather than yeah.
Actually, the 2.4 and the 100.8 were the first two things I put in the grid, if I remember correctly, which is kind of terrifying. But yeah, it's there were people in the comments who it appealed to, but there weren't a lot of people who it appealed to. So.
Let's go to an audience question from Daniel. Daniel had asked, what is important about, or what is personal to you about 1024?
That's an easy one. My birthday is October 24th, so when I realized in high school that would work, yeah, that's been my handle ever since.
Well, that is an easy one. I feel like there was another question about this. Oh yes, Daniel had also asked another question. Which of 2/2 or 2/2 2/10 is a better number?
I'll I'll go with 4 to the 10th here,
Okay.
because I don't necessarily recommend anyone raising the number to the 1024th power. And 4 to 10th, I believe, is the number of bytes in a megabyte, which is kind of cool. So
Yeah. Okay, we'll go with one more with number related. 11 Tickles had asked, "What's your favorite prime number?"
I had to put some thought in on this one. I do have to
Yeah.
shout out first. My dad's favorite number is 47, which is a prime number, so I had to throw that in there. The way my brain works, I tend to gravitate more toward composite numbers than prime numbers, just because
Okay.
there's more stuff to do with them mathematically, at least for arithmetic purposes, which is how where my brain tends toward. But putting some thought in this, I'm going to go with 127. Because it is A, just off of being a power of 2, and B, it is the end of the longest string of composite numbers to that point, and for quite a while. I think it's everything from 114 to 126 is composite. You don't get a streak that long again until you're over 300, and you don't beat it until you're over 500. I did have to look those two up in terms of.
But now that you know about it, it's your favorite. So.
Yep.
Oh, we somehow glossed over this point when we were talking about 159. So I noticed that in a lot of your 159 puzzles, there's a certain deduction that sort of often comes at the end where it almost sort of circles back on itself, in that like you eliminate something because it couldn't work there, and then all of a sudden that disinvigorates the entire thing, even though that was because of another thing that sort of reiterates and falls apart. Why do you use that so often?
It's the indexing deduction.
Yeah.
Essentially, so if you have a 1-2 by value in row 8 column 7, then you can't have 2 in column 1 and row 8, because it eliminates both options for that cell.
Right, exactly.
Basically, I first found that in I think it was Fishy by Zeta Math. He used that, and I was completely hung up on it, and had to. I think that was actually when Zeta and I started messaging each other, was him helping me out on that step in that puzzle. And yeah, the joke answer here is going to be I decided to use that to torture him in return ever since.
Do you not like the step, or?
It's a good step, I think. I just
Okay.
I had trouble spotting it at first, and he
Right.
sometimes has trouble spotting it in the 159 puzzles that he does of mine. Yeah, it's a good step, and like it's honestly, it's not always something I try to build in. It's just something I happen to find in the puzzle, and I'm like, oh, hey, there that is again.
Right. Okay, so speaking of solving puzzles, because I do often see you solving puzzles, how often do you go looking for puzzles to solve, and where do you look for them?
Less than I used to. It's one of the ways I've spent less time setting and solving both lately. I'll try and do like a couple a week on Logic Masters, and then when I feel guilty enough, I'll hop into testing on the Discord and grab something out of there.
Right.
Yeah, it's I still enjoy doing it. I just haven't had as much time as I would like to. Well, I still do the gas and the gap every day. But apart from that, yeah, I don't do as much as I used to.
And what makes you want to solve something versus not want to solve it?
Usually, with notable exceptions, I'll usually look for conventional rule sets. Because again, my time for solving has been reduced.
Right.
And so I don't want to necessarily have to learn an entire new kind of logic to jump in on a puzzle. I'd rather just pull up, a pure killer or a thermo or something like that, and say, okay, I know generally how to start this, and what to look for as far as break-ins go.
Mm-hmm.
I say with some exceptions because I still try and do everything Zetamath puts up, and he definitely does not usually set with conventional rule sets. But
Right. So, do you have a specific setter or setters that you would normally solve from? Obviously, including Zetaman.
yeah, once I found out about the actual option to get an email when a new puzzle goes up on Logic Masters, I signed up for Zetamath and Tolcat immediately. There are still other setters that I'll kind of look for if they have anything new, but yeah, those two are the ones where it's like if they put something up, I'm definitely going to try and do it with variable levels of success sometimes. I think Tallcat's latest took me over 2 hours.
My word. Make sure not to do that one.
It's worth doing, and it took
Okay.
me over 2 hours because I had screwed it up, but
Right. Yeah, you can get sign up for emails for specific setters. I don't know how to do that, but you can do it, is what KNT had said in his interview.
I will say Ictus has mentioned his Killer Cities series. I do try and do those when I come across them as well. Those are all really good.
Do you find more enjoyment in solving or setting puzzles?
Some of each. I mean, I'll subscribe to the theory that has been mentioned before, which is that setting is basically solving a puzzle that doesn't exist yet.
Yeah.
So there's definitely a solving element to setting. If I could only do one, I would probably go with solving, but
Interesting.
I'm glad I don't have to only do one. So
Do you think there's inherent pleasure in setting puzzles?
there can be. There's definitely times when I've done a full set and just really enjoyed the whole process, and then there's some times where I get halfway through and it kind of bogs down and becomes a little more of a slog at that point.
Right. And then the classic question: would you set puzzles even if no one would solve them?
I would say probably not. Partly because I don't always know when I'm done setting a puzzle if it's any good.
Okay.
So like the symmetrical arrow puzzle that got
Mhm.
my most recent feature. When I was setting that, like I know I wanted it to be symmetrical apart from the givens. Partly because, as I think I told Tallcat at the time, if I'm going to actually put givens in a puzzle, they're going to do their job and pull their weight as clues. But like while I was setting that, partly the last two arrows that went in put a bypass into a really nasty step, which was good because it was a nasty step and I wasn't especially happy with it. And the way it solves with those arrows in is much cleaner. But B, yeah, I also haven't done a ton of arrow stuff, and so I wasn't sure how good the puzzle was while I was putting it together. And then
Right.
I submitted to CTC and got an email back from Mark saying, "Hey, we've already had this submitted several times, and Simon's definitely going to try and do it this weekend." And like, oh well, apparently it is pretty good then.
It's actually interesting that you mentioned that because you triggered a thought in my brain that I've never had before. And that's that I think it is much more difficult to know if a puzzle is like quote unquote good or bad or just okay if the constraints are very normal, like are used often, because you almost feel like, is this novel? Is this actually an interesting puzzle? Because it's so familiar in a way.
Yeah. But with this puzzle in particular, once like this puzzle actually branched off of a step that I had in Reach and Sums. The second step in that puzzle is basically repurposed for the break-in in this one, and it seemed so obvious to me that I actually went through all 130 something puzzles on LMD that had the tags arrow and diagonal to make sure that no one had used it before.
Interesting.
And it did in fact being new unless someone had not tagged the puzzle correctly, or obviously it could exist somewhere that's not on Logic Masters. But
Yeah. Is that something that you do often?
no, this is the first time I had
Okay.
done that.
Is it important to you that you know whether or not someone has done the same thing that you've done?
Not necessarily. I don't necessarily think a puzzle has to be completely original to be good. For some reason, it just like the intro to this puzzle is so much of the puzzle that I wanted to make sure that I
Right.
wasn't just completely duplicating someone else's work. Partly just because I haven't done a lot of arrow stuff, and if I was gonna go through and learn how to do arrows again, then I wanted to make sure the work was going to be worthwhile, essentially.
Oh, so you did that before you set the whole thing up.
Yeah,
Okay.
I was once I had the break-in in mind, I went through and was like, surely someone has done this before. No one had done it before.
Nice. Da, 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 da. I think Tolkien has something that is similar to that. Yes, this one. Tolkien asked, which of your puzzles would you say is the best example of your style?
We've touched on this one very briefly, I think.
Yeah.
I'm tempted to say the Entropic 159 puzzle just because it's a coloring 159 puzzle, and it's the only one of those that I put coloring in because I specifically tried to avoid that in the 159 series because coloring with 159 is kind of clunky,
Right.
just because there's already color in the grid for the 159 part. Um, but I'm not going to go with that one because the level of the depth of the logic in that one is not typical of my stuff. I'll say the between lines inequality puzzle, which is kind of funny because it's one of the 2 between lines puzzles I've ever done. But kind of the like I think that's the 5th one in the inequality series, and I had done the first 4 already, and I kind of had between lines in the back of my mind as like I know this is technically an option, um, but I didn't really like between lines as a solver.
Right.
And B, I wasn't 100% sure I could get them to work in the inequality series because it seems like there's so little information in between lines as far as that goes. Um, and then all of a sudden the break-in just popped into my brain one evening. It was like, well, you could do this. Like, yeah, okay, I guess I could do that. And then you could do this other stuff. Like, oh, okay, I guess I'm going to set this puzzle now. Um, and then it worked out pretty well. There's kind of a funny side story with that too, which is I had posted the original version of it in testing on CTC, and I got it like an hour or 2 later. I got a ping from Totally Normal Cat, which was the first time that I had gotten any interaction from Totally Normal Cat, and he was like, "Hey, this puzzle is really cool and interesting, but it's non-unique." Like, oh no. And he was right. It was not unique. I had thought it was unique, and it was not. Um, and then, as Tallcat mentions in the chat, I had adjusted a little bit, and then the inequality was hit really early all of a sudden after I did the first adjustment. And so I had to rework it a little bit. But I'm quite happy with how it turned out. And I'll say it. I'll steal. I think it was Ron Planer's question, which is what puzzle do you wish had got more attention from solvers? I think I would probably go with this one.
Interesting. I didn't actually look. Did this puzzle not was solved 20 times, 92 rating, 4 stars. Not,
Yeah, I think
not really ignored.
yeah, the inequality series had kind of died down
Right.
around this time. I think the next puzzle in the series I think has like 14 solves or something like that. Yeah, I was pretty happy with it. Sent it to CTC, it never went anywhere. So it goes.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's a good puzzle, and the general response from people whose opinions I trust has also been that it's a good puzzle. And so,
Right.
if anyone wants to take a crack at it, please feel free.
Yeah. Here, Well, first I'll ask, do you feel like it's important when you're setting one of these inequality puzzles that the inequality doesn't sort of show up too early, like an unwelcome guest?
I try to keep it that way. Yeah. Like there's nothing wrong with having it show up early necessarily, but I think part of the fun of doing a puzzle like that, where you're
Mhm.
establishing buy values throughout the grid, is that you get the big payoff at the end. Like that
Right.
was when I said zeroth law, for instance. Like it was like, there again, there had been other puzzles that were like that on CTC. It's like the payoff at the end of the hour long video is the fun part. Like the logic is all really interesting, and then you hit the big finish, and that's a nice little reward at the end of the puzzle there. So yeah, I do try and keep the inequality as late as I can.
Right. As Zeta Math says, like sometimes it comes up when he's streaming and he tries to ignore it and keep coloring the buy values in. When you're solving your own puzzle and you're testing it, are you almost trying to ignore the inequality, or are you trying to like see, is the inequality going to be used before too early? Are you like trying to use it as soon as possible?
No, I'm usually trying to keep an eye out and make sure it's not getting hit too early. If it does get
Right.
hit in the mid solve, I'll usually move it.
Interesting. And then related to this, Directionary had asked, do you feel you're ever too picky with yourself when setting a perfect puzzle?
I'll dispute the idea that I've ever actually set a perfect puzzle because I don't know that that's a thing.
Right.
And if it is a thing, I'm pretty sure I haven't done it. Um, yeah, it's a tricky balance to strike sometimes. Basically, the finalizing process for me in setting a puzzle is effectively convincing myself that I set the best version of the puzzle that I reasonably can.
Right.
Um, and sometimes that's pretty easy. Like region sums, I had gotten to an endpoint where I think I had a deadly pattern left and the grid was already pretty crowded. So I backed up a few steps and tweaked a couple things, and then got to like the last line I added to the grid was the one between boxes 3 and 6, uh, which you can see in the background there in the bottom middle. Um, and once I added that, the puzzle surprised the heck out of me by solving completely from that point. I thought I was going to have to add something else. And so at that point, I was like, okay, this is definitely, I'm not going to do better than this. Um, but then I think another one of my CTC features from a while back was X marks the dots 2. I spent pretty much an entire weekend working on that puzzle, and I ended up with like 3 or 4 different versions of the the ending. Partly because that's a negative constraint puzzle, and it was a negative constraint that I couldn't use the solver for, because it was negative constraint on X but not V, and that confuses F puzzles.
Right.
Um, and so I basically hit that one with a hammer for 3 days, and tried to get it to where I was 100% satisfied with it. And I ended up with like 2 or 3 different versions that I was about 95% satisfied with. And at that point, I was like, okay, this is enough. I've spent enough time on this. I don't think I can do it better than it is now. Uh, even if I don't think it's the perfect version of the puzzle, it's probably good enough here.
Right.
And that's something you get from experience, I think, in terms of learning kind of how how far to push that while staying sane.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely that takes experience. Andrew Sakis had asked just in chat right now, do you have a backlog of unfinished puzzles that you intend to go back to someday, or tend to abandon ideas that don't work out? Or do you?
There's a few ideas I have that I have maybe pulled up in F puzzles at some point and eventually closed the tab because they uh, either weren't going anywhere or I wasn't convinced they could go anywhere. I I don't have them stored anywhere besides my head, but there's always the possibility that I'll try and get the black dots 159 puzzle to work, or
Right.
the third X marks the dots puzzle where it's V's and white dots only. Um, so yeah, I don't know that I ever fully abandon an idea, but there are a lot of things that probably are never going to get done.
Right. Right. Yeah. Definitely can sympathize with that. Do you have a puzzling pet peeve? Anything that bothers you when you're setting or bothers you about other people's posts or work or the puzzles themselves or
Probably should have thought about this one before because you ask it every time. Um, come back to that one. I'm going to puzzle over it for a bit.
Okay. It's a puzzle you'll set aside, but it's in the brain.
Good.
You mentioned that Shy's 159 was a puzzle that had a big impact on you. But is there any puzzle that you set that had a big impact on your setting?
I think probably the first inequality puzzle and the first empty 159 puzzle would be two of the big ones there, just because, and both of those were kind of proof of concept. And once
Right.
I confirmed that the concept worked, I enjoyed setting them and wanted to do a lot more of them.
Hmm. How long does it take you to set normally?
At this point, in terms of actual time in front of the computer, probably 3 to 5 hours, maybe. In terms of actual start to finish time while going off and doing other things in between, a few days.
Right. That was one of the most surprising things about my interview with Stephen Burr is he said, "Oh yeah, it takes me a couple days to set a puzzle sometimes," and then later on he clarified that he literally meant he sits there for a couple days and sets the puzzle, no break, which was shocking.
Yeah, I have done that a couple times. I do not recommend it generally.
There's a bot, but I can't see the bot in chat. It's only on the screen. That's really weird. What the heck? Okay, I'm gonna mod codec. Codec, can you get rid of that? I literally can't see it. It won't show up on my screen. That's the strangest thing that's happened. Okay, weird. Anyways, moving on. I feel like YouTube's doing that, which is very, very problematic. What's one of the best pieces of feedback you've ever gotten on a puzzle in testing? Or what kind of
Say,
feedback would you like to receive as well?
yeah. Obviously, positive feedback is always great.
Yeah.
But some of the best feedback I've gotten is on the negative side, honestly, where it's like you shouldn't do that. This deduction
Right.
is not reasonable. Doesn't fit with the rest of the puzzle, that kind of thing. Yeah, that's it's never pleasant to hear that or anything, but it's definitely a valuable piece of information to get from a solver because
Mhm.
that's the main thing you want in a test solve is to make sure that the solver is going to enjoy the puzzle. And if you put something in there that's not going to be enjoyable, then that should probably be fixed.
Right. Do you have any memorable LMD comments or memorable YouTube comments that you've read about your own puzzles?
um, yeah, I think my favorite LMD comment I think was probably on Right of the Rohirrim is from Tilburg. It may be a hidden comment, so I don't know if you'll be able to pull it up on stream. It was basically something along the lines of, I enjoyed this puzzle so much that I went back and solved it again.
That's cute. That's a nice comment. Sorry, my cat's doing something. I don't know. Getting some cookies from the cookie jar, I guess. Let's talk about coloring real quick. So Naverio had asked, you're very well known for setting puzzles that utilize coloring. What do you think is the appealing factor behind puzzles where you get to choose between two values for a specific cell that gets resolved late in the solve. So I think he's talking about the situations where you choose like either 1 or 9 and then go back and change it. Maybe is that what?
Yeah. Probably the inequality series would be the main set with that, although X marks the dots 2 works that way with a different set of by values. Yeah, I think I kind of touched on this a little bit earlier. I like setting things that have kind of a big cathartic payoff at the end of the solve. It's not quite the same, but it's almost just like telling a story where you have the climax and resolution at the end. It's kind of nice to have kind of the tension build throughout the solve, and then the release at the end where everything comes together all at once.
Right. And related to that, Talkhead had asked you, you have a reputation as the coloring guy. Do you mind that, and do you think it's fair / warranted?
I definitely can't say it's unfair at this point. I went back through my LMD archive just in preparation for answering this question. It turns out roughly half of the puzzles I have up there have some element of coloring in them, which is more than I thought it was going to be. And sometimes it's just like 10 lines where you can kind of color to break them up, or there'll be like one little pair that gets colored in there, or doublers or S cells where you're probably going to indicate that by coloring, but you could do it in other ways.
Right.
Yeah, I do set a lot of coloring puzzles, so I don't think it's unfair. The drawback, and I think this is kind of touched on in chat earlier, is that sometimes people will go into my puzzles expecting coloring, and then it ends up not being a coloring puzzle. They're trying to find the coloring or coloring unnecessarily and looking for logic that isn't there.
Right. Some people, especially with the sort of relabeling part of coloring, say that that's a very like tired trope and there's nothing new you can do with it and stuff like that. What do you think about that, and what do you do to keep that sort of logic fresh, or why do you think that logic isn't as stale as people seem to think it is?
I'll say I don't necessarily think you have to do something brand new for it to be a good puzzle. Like as long as it's still enjoyable, then I've solved. I think for instance Kropke XV, like there's a limit to the amount of logic or the logic you come up with in Kropke XV at this point, but I still will pretty much always enjoy a Kropke XV puzzle when I sit down and solve one.
Fair enough. Yeah. I mean, like the gas doesn't really. There's no novelty about gas, right? But it's still enjoyable to solve gas.
Yeah, I mean they're specifically trying to avoid novelty because they want it to be simple stuff that you can just sit down and do at the drop of a hat.
Exactly.
I mean, novelty kind of requires extra thought by the solver.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, maybe coloring is something that's been done to death, but I'm okay with that more or less.
As long as you enjoy it, right?
Pretty much. Well, as long as I enjoy it, and as long as the solvers enjoy it, and for the most part, they seem to.
Yeah. What's a piece of advice that you received early on in your setting career that really helped you?
I think the one that comes immediately to mind was technically before my setting career because it was from Jovial's setting video. It was reward your solvers.
Right.
If you make your solver do something hard, then there should be a payoff to doing something hard.
Mm-hmm.
You have to spot an X-wing or a swordfish or something like that. Then you should get digits out of that, or a pair, or something like that. Yeah, like in negative space, for instance, which is the one that Brems did a little bit ago. That's my second puzzle. Once you get the remote 1-2 pair that pays off like was seen in the highlights at the beginning, then you not only get the 8-9 pair and the 3-4 pair adjacent to box 9, but it also the 8-9 pair is immediately resolved because you have a 13 cage that can't be 9-4 because you have the 4 already accounted for in box 9.
Right. Is there any piece of advice you often hear that you disagree with? And I'm just gonna grab something real quick. So answer the question, and I'm just gonna be right back.
I don't hear this one as much as I used to, but it came up early in my setting career. Was basically along the lines of if a clue isn't required, then it should be removed essentially. So one of my earlier puzzles, I had added a clue to. I knew the clue wasn't necessarily required to make the puzzle unique, but I thought that it made the solve path cleaner. And then a couple of people, it turned out, didn't use it during their solves at all, and I got a couple comments like, I thought it was a good puzzle, but it had this extra clue in it. You know, perfectly well-meaning in saying that, but and of course this was also before I was having things tested before I would put them up on LND because I wasn't on the Discord yet. But yeah, it's not necessarily true that a clue should be removed if it isn't required, because it can still help for signaling, or it can help smooth out the solve path. And a lot of times adding those in can help the solver out and make it a better puzzle.
Right. I was gonna come back with a cat, but I didn't. I ended up coming back with a cat, but I'll bring the cat anyway. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. That sentiment of, I think I've talked at length about this before, so I won't get into it right now. But yeah, I totally agree with that sentiment. So, is there any piece of advice you'd like to give to other setters, maybe newer setters?
Yeah, this is definitely one that has come up, I think, at least in Tirganus' stream and possibly some of the others. Yeah. You don't have to make the solver figure out everything that you had to figure out about a puzzle.
Mm-hmm.
That can backfire pretty hard in some cases. I'll use reach and sums as an example on this, where I did this right. There's definitely examples where I did it wrong. But in reach and sums, once you have the initial two 5-cell lines in the grid and they go through boxes 2 and 4, the doubler in box 1 has to be row 2, column 2. And proving that it has to be row 2, column 2 is really annoying. It requires you to keep track of both digit position and doubler position, and doing that simultaneously is a huge pain. And so it took me a while to figure out how to allow the solver to prove that in a much easier way, which I ended up doing with the long line there, positioned how it is. And the long line also plays in about 3 other times in the solve. It's a good clue. So
nice. Definitely.
Yeah, it was useful in both indicating something I already knew, but also making further progress in the puzzle.
Yeah, for sure. Have you done any collaborative setting?
I have done a little bit of collaborative setting. I had initially thought I had only done 3 collab puzzles. I ended up remembering a 4th one, which did never actually get posted anywhere apart from CTC testing. But the 2 main ones that people might remember are probably the ones I did with Tallcat for the second Lockout Lines pack. And then I did one recently with Malrog, which was a Killer X puzzle. Definitely a different experience, because it's nice to have someone to kind of bounce ideas off of or pass things back and forth to.
Yeah.
It's also nice kind of having a separate perspective to work with in terms of setting. But yeah, it's not something I have a ton of experience with. I would not mind collaborating more. But yeah, just
sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was just gonna ask, is there anyone you feel like, yeah, I would really want to collaborate with this person, even if it's like someone you can't really contact?
I'd love to do a collab with Zeta at some point. I would be perfectly happy to do a collab with you, which I'll say when you were answering that question on your own kind of stream, I was very flattered to be included in the list of people you'd be interested in collaborating with at some point. So yeah, it's kind of a matter of finding the right idea to do that on, and a time when the people are available. And
Yeah.
but yeah, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily be opposed to collaborating with just about anyone, but uh, yeah, Zeta would be the person who probably comes to mind most immediately, just because we're very similar in some ways and very different in some ways, and I think we could do some
Right.
cool stuff.
Complement each other, sort of fill in the gaps.
Yeah.
All right. Talk about the most recent puzzle that you finished setting. How did you go about doing it, and what's it all about?
The most recent one I just put up in testing yesterday, actually. It is, instead of an XV puzzle, it is an XXX puzzle with doublers. So if anyone wants to take a run at that and see if it is reasonable, I'd be happy to have feedback on that, because the break-in is kind of weird.
Yeah.
The most recent one on LND is currently a quads 10 lines puzzle, which is a nice, clean 2-star solve, which I'm pretty happy with. And then the one that'll go up on LMD on Tuesday is a killer numbered rooms puzzle, which is the first time I've tried numbered rooms. I'm definitely behind the curve on terms of numbered rooms, because I know that's been happening for a while.
Right.
I think I took kind of a setting hiatus for about 3 months between like February and May of this year. And when I came back, numbered rooms had blown up and chaos construction had blown up, and I completely missed both of them. So
Is that something you want to go back and sort of fill in, like the chaos constructions and the number of rooms?
chaos construction, probably not. I have one idea for it that I may or may not ever actually be able to finish, because it's not. I'm not comfortable solving it, and it's hard to set something you're not comfortable solving.
Right.
Numbered rooms, I have generally enjoyed solving when I've tried it. I just haven't played around with it a whole lot yet. But I'm pretty happy with how the first puzzle worked out, and I may come back to it.
Kodak asks, how do you like numbered rooms as a constraint? I guess
Yeah,
you
it
just
was
said.
with the the options it gives you in terms of interplay between, especially numbered rooms plus another constraint, is pretty fun.
Yeah.
And I defaulted to killer because I often default to killer because I'm most comfortable solving that. I know the combinations for especially small killer cages quite well, so they're pretty easy to work with, and that made for a pleasant setting experience.
Right. Choose some very creative names of your puzzles. How do you come up with the puzzle name?
So for the most part, like most of my puzzles tend to run on the theme of essentially take two constraints and smush them together and see what happens. And in those puzzles, I will generally also take the names of the constraints and smush them together and make that the name of the puzzle.
Right.
So, X marks the dots is X and Kropke, or quadruple the entropy, quadruple the fun is obviously entropic lines and quadruples. The entirely unpronounceable 159 puzzle names that I have, where it's just basically a series of digits arranged in ways that are like the constraint plus 159 in some way.
Right.
On single constraint puzzles, some of them are pretty obvious. I have a puzzle called the Dirty Dozen, where all the killer cages are sums of 12. But if it's something that's a little more like standard constraints, but the solve path is weird, I'll try and kind of hint at that.
Right.
In the title sometimes. So like Unbound, for instance, is a killer that I did recently, and there's kind of a hint in the title in terms of how the puzzle works.
So, not to like ask you to spoil anything. Well, no, I'm asking you to spoil it. If you don't, if you haven't solved the puzzle yet, skip over this. But how does the name hint at the way to solve it? I'm just curious.
Yeah, the logic in the puzzle in first row 789, then column 789, then rows 1, 2, 3 is that they can't be roped.
Right.
So you prove that row 789 can't be roped, and then that establishes where a lot of things go in them. And then once you do that, you can prove that column 789 can't be roped. And then you can prove that that rows 1, 2, 3 can't be roped. So unbound is, not roped essentially.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Unbound. Yeah, that makes that. Sorry. Stupid OBS. Have you ever solved, or sorry, have you ever set non-Sudoku, and how did that go?
I have 1 star battle on LMD. It's a nice little 2-star star battle, both in terms of difficulty and in terms of the actual rules. It's a 2-star star battle. And I had an idea to do a star battle. I figured I'd try it out, and then I was pretty happy with how it turned out, and I just threw it up on LMD because that's what I do with most of the puzzles I'm pretty happy with.
Mm-hmm.
And it didn't occur to me at the time that nobody puts just vanilla star battle on LMD. So that puzzle has like 45 solves and a decent rating. And I think it was the first of my 2 ever Fistamafel solves. Not necessarily because it's an especially good puzzle, but because I think Fistamafel was probably confused that someone had put a basic star battle on LMD.
That's funny. Yeah, I don't remember many, not even just star battles, but any like vanilla pencil puzzles on LMD.
Yeah, if you click on just the star battle tag, at the time I posted that one, at least it was like the first page of it would go back a year, and most of it was star battle hybridized with with 2 other things,
Right.
in ways that would confuse and frighten me if I looked at them.
Do you solve a lot of non-Sudoku, or some non-Sudoku?
I do the gap. Apart from that, not much. And I have more success with some of the gaps than others. Probably the closer it is to Sudoku, the better I am at it usually. Yeah, I might delve into non-Sudoku at some point a little bit more than I have, but my comfort level is not the same, so it would
Right.
it would take some build up.
When you set the star battle, did you set it in the same sort of way you'd set a Sudoku, or was it a completely different process?
It was pretty similar. Again, I had the break-in in mind before I sat down.
Right.
And then it was a matter of just playing around with it. And the initial structure I had at first was broken, which took me a little while to prove. So I tweaked it enough that it wasn't broken, and then I tweaked it enough that it solved, and then I was done. It was probably a quicker set than most of my Sudoku stuff, even though I hadn't done it before.
Interesting.
Because again, it's binary options in most pencil puzzles, or certain more limited options than Sudoku is, at least.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly in Star Battle, it's either star or no star, and that's it.
Right.
There's only so much you can do with it, especially when you're doing a smaller grid and not trying to make it too complicated.
Yeah. And only star battle, no hybrid or anything like that. I'm sure it can get very complicated when it's hybridized.
No doubt.
How would you describe your reputation as a constructor?
Outside of the coloring guy?
Yeah, outside of that. We've covered that part.
Yeah. I think, my typical puzzle on LMD is, 3.5 stars probably. It's in terms of, I like to build in essentially a relatively clean solve path, I hope.
Yeah.
Like I'm not usually going to make you put in a ton of thought about any specific step, including the break-in.
Mhm.
I will say, especially when I'm doing something that's kind of unorthodox, I'll try and set the easiest version of it as the break-in, and then build in difficulty from there. Which I guess I'll throw that in as another piece of advice to a new setter is if you're doing something weird, especially do the easy version of it first, and then build it up from there. I'll say, going back to the Christoph Seeliger puzzle that was the first one I solved. I did a puzzle with those same rules, which is all the killer cages and little killers have to have perfect square totals, and the first clue in the grid is just an 8-cell cage that has to be 36.
Right. That makes sense. Where I was going to ask where did the name Twototenth come from, but we already covered that. If you were to specialize or only set one type of puzzle or one variant for the rest of your setting career, what would you choose?
I would go with killer. Killer is just way too versatile for me to pick anything else.
Right.
You can do a killer puzzle that has cages through the entire grid, or you can do a white room, where you have 18 cells caged.
Yeah.
You can do coloring. You can do, all cages have the same total. You can do so much logic with killer that I don't think there's any other constraint that has that level of versatility.
Right. Yeah. Killer is amazing. What's your biggest puzzling regret?
Biggest regret. This is a lot more recent than it should be. A puzzle I posted a few months ago called Truth or Consequads, where I had put it through testing, was ready to post it on LMD. It's a good puzzle. The version that's on LMD I'm quite happy with. But once I had gone through testing, I looked over the grid again and I was like, I don't think I used this clue in the test solve. And so I removed the clue and verified the solver that the puzzle was still unique, which it was. I was like, okay, that's good. And I did not test solve it again, and that was a bad idea. Completely ruined the solve path.
Oh no.
It's the one quad in box 9. Don't try and solve the puzzle without the one quad in box 9. Yeah, it did not work out well, and I put it up on LMD like that. And then I think Directionary messaged me a day or two later. Is like, I'm not sure how to solve the puzzle from this point. And I looked at it again. And was like, yeah, neither am I. So I edited it and reposted with the correct clues. But yeah, that essentially killed that puzzle as far as LMD is concerned. I think I have 4 puzzles that are quads plus one kind of line, and the other 3 all have like 60 plus solves, and this one has 20 something. So
right.
That was deserved by me, but not by the puzzle.
Definitely. What's a question that you haven't been asked so far, but we would like to be asked, and what's your answer to it?
Nothing comes immediately to mind, honestly. I probably had something in mind at some point, and it is not there anymore.
Still,
yeah,
the
we
pet
can
peeves question is unanswered as well. Codex, keep an eye on you.
Yeah, we'll see if I can come up with something for pet peeves at least.
My pet peeve is when I can't think of any pet peeves. It's really annoying. All right.
Yeah, I think something along the lines of trying to put in a constraint that isn't used early on, and then you have to remember it later in the solve. Especially if it's something like anti-night or a negative constraint or something like that normally you would be focusing on kind of throughout the solve. If it doesn't come up till the end, then I'm going to have forgotten it by the time I get there.
Right. Or a single little killer clue. Actually,
I like the single little killer clue, actually.
I think I might do a pre-recorded video on why the single little killer clue sucks. Uh,
Yeah, I'll say the single little killer clue I think is a little more defensible because it's on the screen. Like you can see it there. Something like anti-night or a negative constraint on XV or something like that is not something that's immediately visually obvious.
but in the same way that that the anti-night or or whatever the negative constraint would be on the rules on the screen, the little killer is on the screen, but it's not on the grid that you're looking at. It's just outside the grid, just like the rules are. And sometimes it's really easy to focus in on the grid and not think about anything outside of that. So it's really easy to miss like a little killer clue over there.
Yeah, that's right. This will be covered in rapid fire, I think, but I do have that issue with outside clues in general sometimes.
Yeah, whenever I set without outside clues, I make sure to make those the main part of the puzzle rather than
like even when they're the main part, I will sometimes find myself forgetting them. Like I think there was a gas puzzle that took me 45 minutes because it was a sandwich puzzle, and I was just overlooking one of the sandwich clues.
Right. Yeah. In that way, I wish we could mark outside clues as like being used or not. I wish that would. I'm gonna suggest that to Sven at some point to mark outside clues as being used or not, because I think that would be very useful. Just like a check mark or like turn them green or something by clicking on them. Right. That would be nice. Playmaker6174 had asked, "What's your best moment when it comes to setting, and do you have specific variants or genres that you usually like to set puzzles with?" I think those are two different questions. So the first one, I am not exactly sure what Playmaker's asking, but maybe what is like your favorite moment in the setting process? Or maybe what's the favorite moment that you've had at some point?
Favorite setting moment is probably finding the last thermo in Zeroth Law 1. Because that one had taken me several days. Zeroth Law was quite a process, actually, because it was originally supposed to be anti-king, along with irregular and diagonal, and I kept toying with it and it kept breaking. And then I had one version that resolved down to an X-wing of... I was actually setting it in Excel, so I was using letters as placeholders. And so I had like an FJ X-wing as the last two things, but in opposite corners of it, one was diagonally adjacent to an F and one was diagonally adjacent to a J, and everything else had resolved up to that point, and then it was broken.
Right.
So I ended up giving up on anti-king at that point. But then after removing that, I had tried a couple of different thermos to resolve the digits finally. And the first one I had in there hit too early in the solve path, and I wasn't happy with that. And then the second one was kind of in the bottom middle, close to where the one that's in there now is, but it didn't resolve the corners. And so I had to put in a couple of extra 2-cell thermos to resolve those. And then I found the one that's in there now. And there have been other moments like that where I've just found, stumbled across the perfect clue to resolve a puzzle. But none of the other ones got me my first CTC feature, so this one wins by default.
Nice. At some point, not this time, but another time, Ron Planer had asked, did you have like a mentor or an experienced setter that helped you when you were first starting?
Not directly. Or and anyone who gave testing feedback was helpful, of course. There wasn't anyone I like struck up a super close relationship with in my first couple of months of setting.
Right.
The first person I kind of established a kind of solving exchange relationship with was probably Tallcat. He had done one of my puzzles and I did one of his, and we kind of just went from there.
I know this is a question that I ask normally, but I can't find it on my document. So, how often do you talk to other setters when you're setting puzzles about your current projects and such?
During the setting process, I'll usually try and figure it out on my own if I can. I will sometimes ping people if I just want a second pair of eyes on a particular step. My most recent puzzle, I messaged Directionary and was like, "You make sure that this is, this break-in is actually doable by a sane human, because I've been staring at it for 2 days and want to make sure that it actually works." But yeah, usually I'll try and fly solo if I can.
And I can't remember if you answered it when you were answering whether or not you. Sorry, I'll just ask a question. Do you tend to set in contiguous amounts of time, or like is it just a little bit at a time over a long period of time?
I used to do continuous, and I find myself not doing that as much anymore. Usually it'll take me, a couple days spread out over time to get something I'm happy with.
Right. Okay,
Continuous is great if I can do it.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, continuous is great if I can keep finding steps that I'm happy with, but I don't want to force it to be continuous, basically, because then I tend to shortcut things.
Right. Okay, rapid fire questions. One or the other as fast as you can. Local or global deductions?
Local. I think probably 95% of the deductions in my puzzles are local.
Coloring or good living?
Coloring. I'm sure everyone's shocked. I do pencil mark a whole lot, though.
Okay.
So a lot of my setting style does tend to actually reward extreme pencil marking. I know people try and dissuade that sometimes, and I definitely do not.
We'll come back to that at the end, because I know you collaborate with Tallcat, so I want to actually touch on that. Geometry or arithmetic?
I like geometry, but I love arithmetic.
Right.
Arithmetic is my favorite.
Penpa or F puzzles?
F puzzles.
Sudoku or pencil puzzles?
Sudoku.
Chaos or order?
Order.
Cages or lines?
I'll say lines. I like killer a lot, but there's so many other kinds of lines. There's really just the one kind of cage most of the time.
Dots or arrows?
Dots.
To disambiguate a puzzle, a given or a clue?
Clue. I'm sure that's a shock as well.
Outside or inside clues?
Inside.
And Ron Planer had asked this, and I think it's a bit of a joke question: inequality or two-cell thermo?
It's definitely a joke question. I'll say this one actually depends on context. If it's the only thing, if it's the only
Yeah.
Greater than, less than in a puzzle, I'll put inequality. But if you've got other thermos in there, obviously you put a thermo.
I love Marcus in the chat says Hotel Trivago. Wait, we come back to, what was it? Oh, right, the good living. So you say you tend to reward lots of pencil marks in the grid, and you collaborate. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
My style as a solver is I pencil mark probably too much. I will sometimes find a deduction that is only available from pencil marking, and I will sometimes use that.
Right. How did that style go over when you collaborated with Tallcat, who is notorious for his sparse pencil marking?
We didn't do it. I don't think the puzzles we collabed on had a ton of pencil marking in them, as it worked out. Yeah, I mean, there's some, but not a lot.
Interesting. I'm just imagining, because sometimes like you'll pass a puzzle back and forth, like the link to it, and I'm just imagining like he passes it to you, you solve, and like there's just a ton of pencil marks in the grid, and then you pass it back to him, and then he just deletes all the pencil marks and then passes it back to you.
Yeah, there's I think less passing back and forth in our particular collabs than would necessarily have been usual for collaborative setting, in just the way the puzzles worked out. the first thing we did Gravitron first, and the first thing I sent him on that was the break-in with the kind of the ring of lockout lines, and the X clues that hit the diamonds on those. And I had that break-in in mind for a while and knew that the diamonds had a a unique setup within 1/9 x 10 minus x disambiguation. And then Tallcat took it and was like, filling in all the values in the corner boxes, and it's like, wow, this goes a lot further than I thought it did to begin with. So, yeah, that was something like half of that solve was just, or half of that set was just us realizing how much the break-in actually did in that puzzle.
Cool.
And then Coriolis, he had the initial setup, and I put in the givens, and then I think I landed 2 other clues in that one, to the final grid at least, and he did the closing logic on it.
Interesting.
I think both of those only got, in terms of actual clues being added to the grid, only got passed back and forth 2 or 3 times.
Right. And there was no like live collaboration effort. It was all just like back and forth.
Not in terms of like screen share or anything. We were kind of both working on it around the same time, but yeah, neither of us was like watching the other one actually add things and solve or anything like that.
It's really interesting that you still managed to find new ideas and new things with sort of older, quote unquote older. For example, the symmetric arrow puzzle with the diagonal, like that's sort of a newer idea with older techniques, without using any sort of novel rule set. What would you say to people who have a lot of trouble finding those kinds of things? Like how do you come up with those ideas that are more novel with older things?
I don't necessarily have a way to give advice on that. I just kind of mull things over, and sometimes an idea pops up, and again, the anti-roping killer I had, Zeta had done a stream of my previous killer and made a comment along the lines of, well, this could be roped, but that would be boring. And it was in fact roped. And so I was like, well, okay, maybe he'll like one better where the entire point is that it can't be roped. And so I tried to come up with a way to do that, and it worked out pretty well. Yeah, I don't know that I have any particularly helpful advice on that score, unfortunately.
I like how there's been 2 mentions of you setting puzzles to spite Zeta Math.
There's some level of spite and some level of, I know he does a lot of my stuff, and so
yeah,
I do try and hopefully do things that he will enjoy.
Do you feel like you have an audience that you set towards now, like a defined sort of group?
To some extent, I've been fortunate enough that all of my puzzles on LMD currently are rated, and they tend, the new ones I put up tend to get rated within a day or two, and that's, I know it's something that not every setter can count on there, because that's a very, very crowded platform at this point.
Right.
So yeah, I would say LMD is probably my primary audience at this stage. Comparing, like, I deeply appreciate all the testing and stuff on the CTC Discord, but once I put something in the CTC archive, it'll probably get like 2 or 3 solves beyond people I tag as testers, and no new feedback from anyone who wasn't a tester already. Whereas on LMD, I'll usually get at least a couple dozen solves and a few comments. And
what's the optimal environment for you to set a puzzle in? Like, do you have to have silence, or can it be loud in the room? Do you listen to music while you set a puzzle?
Generally, I will set at home in more or less silence, although I will, when I step away from setting, I'll watch stuff on YouTube or whatever. But yeah, I won't usually have anything else going on during the actual setting process.
Right. What do you think is your best puzzle name?
Best puzzle name. I'm partial to region sum region sums
Yeah, that's a good one.
because it's again that's me mashing the two constraints together, but it's region sums and then with doubler it sounds like you're saying it twice.
That is a funny idea for a puzzle name. How often do you want? Sorry, go ahead.
I'll throw zeroth law of chromodynamics in there too, just because it's
Yeah.
overtly ridiculous. But in a
How often do you watch people solve puzzles these days? Like, do you watch ZetaMath stream or CTC very often?
I'll check in on Zeta when I can. Honestly, I watch a lot less CTC than I used to outside of like watching, you know, either my own features or features of my friends essentially. Just because again my Sudoku time has been constrained a lot, and usually I'm going to devote that either to my own setting or my own solving.
Right. This is an interesting question, which is a little bit hard to answer. How do you know when you set a great puzzle? Oh my word! What the heck is? Okay.
Typically, it's when other people tell me that they like the puzzle.
Sorry, 1 second. OBS just lost its mind.
Yeah, I think I kind of mentioned earlier, like it's hard for me to gauge how good a puzzle is once I've set it.
Right.
Partly because I've usually been thinking over it for a couple days at least at that point, and so yeah, I usually will judge that based on the feedback that the puzzle gets.
Makes sense. Okay, well that's the best the chat's gonna get, I guess. All right. Sorry about that. Interruption from OBS. Of all the puzzle ideas you have or puzzles you attempt to set, what percentage do you think end up getting published?
Out of ideas, I will usually try and set things to completion when I can. So I'd say probably 60 to 75% of ideas probably end up being finalized and published. In terms of completed puzzles, it's obviously even higher than that because sometimes I have ideas that don't get completed. Yeah, I think probably something like 90% of my completed puzzles that I'm pretty happy with have ended up on LMD at some point.
How
my LMD standards are a lot lower than some people's, I think.
Right. How big is your backlog of puzzles that you're wanting to publish to LMD?
I have one that'll go up this coming Tuesday, and I have one that will go up 2 weeks from Tuesday, and that's what I got. I used to have a lot I do now, but yeah, now my setting time has been reduced enough that I'm trying to just stay one puzzle ahead, essentially.
Codex asks, so now I wonder what's the longest time between conceptualization of an idea and eventual publication of a puzzle. He says for him it's about a year.
That is a good question. For that, I would probably say the Entropic 159 puzzle, which had been kind of kicking around for a few months before I was able to actually take the time to get it working.
Interesting.
And then once I had set it, it was still a while longer, I think, before it got posted because it was going in a pack, and we wanted to release the pack before
Right.
it actually went up to MD.
Makes sense. Um, so speaking of ideas, like you say you have a lot of break-in ideas. Do you have a lot of, or do you have not even a lot of, but do you have ideas sometimes about like new constraints or new novel ideas, but you just don't know what to do with them? Or is it just that you don't ever have ideas about new constraints? It's more just ideas about existing constraints that work in break-ins.
Yeah, I think it's more like my brain, again, like the break-ins I have ideas for will generally just pop into my head while I'm doing other things.
Right.
So my brain is more geared toward thinking about existing constraints than trying to come up with new ones and also figure out how to set them at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Right. Um, yeah, it's a very unorthodox occurrence when you have some idea for like a break-in with a constraint that doesn't exist. Like you just want to do this
Yeah.
thing that revolves around the interaction between these relationships, but you're not sure how the relationships are cohesing together yet. That
Right.
is a very strange occurrence, at least for me. I'm sure there are some setters that do that every Thursday or whatever.
Yeah, definitely. That's an extra step that my brain is not used to making.
Right. Uh, coming back to the pet peeves.
I think we did the pet peeves actually. It was
Oh, do we?
having the extra invisible constraint that doesn't come in until late in the solve path.
Ah, right. We did do that. Um, for some reason, I thought that was the extra question that you wanted to be asked. And I wasn't sure what the question was, but I
Right.
heard you answer, but maybe I got confused.
I do have an idea for an extra question now, actually.
Yay.
So the LMD rating system, again, I appreciate LMD a great deal. I love that they let us muck up their portal with all of our unsolicited Sudoku puzzles.
Mhm.
Um, but what I would do, like essentially the niceness rating on LMD currently does not necessarily reflect how good the puzzle is very well. It reflects who has solved the puzzle.
Right.
And I'm not just talking about the one person everyone's going to think I'm talking about here. There's a subset of solvers there who are much more willing to give ratings of average or nice
Right.
than the rest of the solvers on the portal. And so if 3 of your first 10 solvers are those guys, then you might debut at a 92. And if 1 of your first 10 is those guys, you might get a 98.
Mhm.
Um, and so what I would do to change that from where it exists currently and with the standards that currently exist on the site is instead of going 0 to 4 in terms of the ratings, I would go 0 to 8. Because for me as a solver, I'm reluctant to go anything below very nice, because if the first 10 solvers who rate a puzzle give a rating of nice, it's going to debut at 75% and no one's ever going to look at it again.
Right.
But if the first 10 solvers gave a 7 out of 8, then it debuts at 88%, and that's not going to immediately kill it off.
Yeah. That's a good suggestion at least. Yeah.
I would say in isolation, you would go 0 to 10, but 0 to 8 allows you to preserve the existing ratings in terms of keeping the same scale. So I also wish they would do half stars in difficulty.
Oh yeah,
just
for
because
sure.
I cannot figure out the math on the difficulty ratings. If you look at how they break down, I have, I think, 3 or 4 5-star puzzles on there where they've received more 4-star ratings than 5-star ratings, but they still show up as 5 stars, and I don't know why.
I think someone's worked out the cutoff is like 4.2 or something is rated as 5.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Which is kind of weird, but
And basically, I would like to have a rating on LMD that I can give a puzzle that says, this is a nice puzzle and you should totally solve it, but it's also not 2 truths and a lie or a Jormungandr
Right.
or pick your all-time great Sudoku puzzle.
Yeah. Like for example, with Starlight, for example, when I published that, people were saying, it got scorped and now it's at 96 instead of 98. That's such a it's such a terrible thing. And I was kind of saying, like, I set this in like an hour, and I normally take so long to set these things. I set it really quickly because I was doing a video on it. A video of me live setting it, and I don't want to edit like 5 hours of me sitting there setting it. So I don't actually care that it's at 96. That seems almost more representative of what it is to me. So
Yeah,
honestly,
and
yeah.
96 is still good too.
Yeah, it's
like
great.
96 is being rated.
Or maybe it went down to 86. I can't remember actually. I can't remember. Anyways, it doesn't even matter. It was like, yes, this is not a 100% puzzle. I would be the first to admit that. So I don't need it to be at 96.
And yeah, that's part of it too. Is like, you know, some of the puzzles I feel like could be rated better, but some of them seem like they're rated honestly too high. Like
Yeah.
I have 200% puzzles, and one of them I don't think should be 100%. I have no idea how Carousel has survived as 100% as long as it has. That is not a good puzzle.
You just need to create an alt account and then downrate it.
I keep waiting for someone to just pull this solve grid for that one off of Zeta's old stream of it and vote it down.
But yeah, that brings us to the hour mark. So that's all the time we have. But this was great, Twototenth, and thank you so much for coming on and having this conversation. It slowed down a little bit.
Thanks for having me.
It slowed down a little bit as I sort of ran out of questions, and also started to get a bit tired myself. So that's definitely on me. But thanks everyone for sticking it out anyway. We were going really fast at the beginning, and I think that's why we ran out of time, or ran out of questions, because we were going through all of them really quickly. But
announcing next interview?
Yes, we need to do that. I have actually remembered to tell Twototenth who the next setters are, or setter is for Spotlight. So I will allow him to announce the next ones for next week.
Yeah, the next setter spotlight will be of Woofer ZFG and Jacob.
Yeah, I let slip setters by accident.
I will look forward to that one because it'll be interesting hearing a team.
Yeah.
How that works.
It'll also be interesting me trying to format that on the screen. It's a little bit different, but yeah, it should be fun. I'm looking forward to it. Thanks everyone for spending a little bit of your weekend with us today, and if you enjoy this kind of work, please subscribe, please like and comment and all that stuff for the algorithm, and if you really want to support, you can always support us on Patreon. These are the people who currently support us on Patreon. There's a whole lot more of them than I thought there would be when I first started, but you know, if you want to add to that list, I'll definitely put your name up here, and happy to have you, of course. So thanks everyone for coming out, and have a good rest of your day.